There are over 7,000 languages spoken on Earth right now. Every one of them traces back, if you follow the linguistic evidence far enough, to a handful of proto-languages that themselves trace back to a single ancestral tongue. Linguists call it proto-human speech. The trail goes cold around 50,000 years ago. However, the Book of Enoch does not stop there. It names the structure of what existed before that silence, records who held it, describes what it could do, and documents exactly why it was taken from the human race. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the original human language, Enoch describes the phonetic structure of the pre-flood sacred speech, the specific Ge'ez passages naming what was removed from human civilization, the council minutes from 364 CE, listing language as the explicit reason for the ban. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. The Book of Enoch is not a single document. It is 5 separate books written across different centuries and assembled into one text by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is the only church on earth that never stopped treating it as scripture. When archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch turned up. More copies than were found of Exodus, more than Numbers, more than most books that survived into the standard Old Testament. The fragments designated 4Q201 and 4Q204, now housed at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, contain portions of what scholars call the Book of the Watchers, the oldest section of Enoch, dated to approximately 150 BCE on the basis of script analysis and the surrounding stratigraphic material. What those fragments preserve, and what the full Ge'ez manuscripts at Axum carry in complete form, is a description of speech that operates differently from anything in human linguistic history. The relevant text is in chapter 69 of the Ethiopic Enoch. Michael Knibb's 1978 Ge'ez translation, the standard critical edition used by most English-language scholars, renders verse 14 this way. Caspiel is named as the being who revealed the secret oath to the holy Michael. But the Ge'ez term the text uses for what Caspiel revealed is not simply oath. The word in the manuscript at Axum was recorded by Ephraim Isaac in his 1983 Oxford translation, the definitive translation produced directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts, as Qual Kadus, which translates as holy speech, the sacred voice, or the divine utterance. Not a promise in the legal sense, a mode of speech that carries within itself the structural force of creation. That distinction matters. Chapter 69 begins laying out what this speech was, not through definition but through consequence. Verses 6 through 12 describe what happened when the Watchers brought this speech into contact with human civilization. They did not simply teach human language. They transmitted specific components of the divine utterance system. Penemu taught the art of writing with ink and paper. Kazdeha taught forbidden biological knowledge. Gadriel taught the instruments of war. But before all of these, verse 6 inches, the Isaac translation includes a passage, the R. H. Charles, 1906, English edition, omitted entirely, which Isaac restored from the Ge'ez and flagged explicitly. The missing passage identifies the Watchers as having transmitted portions of the sacred speech to human beings in written form. Using the Ge'ez construction Lisan Kadus, meaning the holy tongue, the language set apart. The surrounding text handles the holy tongue as a concrete object, something that was possessed, transmitted, and then deliberately withdrawn. This connects directly to what follows in verses 13 through 15. Verse 14 states that a secret was sworn before the creation of the world. Not at the creation, before it. The oath was sworn before the sky was stretched out, before the sea was given its boundary, before the mountains were set. And the content of the oath in verse 15 of the Isaac translation is this: "The holy name by which heaven and earth were created shall not be spoken by any being of flesh and blood." The name holds the structure of creation in position. It is the mechanism by which the original speech ordered physical reality. And the oath is the agreement, sworn before matter existed, that human beings would not possess it. R. H. Charles, whose 1906 English translation became the standard Western reference for most of the 20th century, translated Kal Kadus as something like voice of heaven, abstract and non-specific. He omitted the verse containing Lisan Kadus without comment. The effect of these choices is the accumulated weight of a scholarly tradition preferring the symbolic reading over the concrete. But the Ge'ez manuscripts say what they say. There was a specific structured speech of divine origin by which the created order was maintained. The Watchers transmitted portions of it to human beings, and a decision was made, recorded in an oath that predates physical matter, that this transmission could not be allowed to stand. The Egyptian tradition preserves a parallel account so close to the Enochic framework that the overlap cannot be accidental. The ancient Egyptians called the divine language Medu Netjer, the words of the gods. The hieroglyphic writing system was not understood by its practitioners as a human invention or an administrative tool. It was understood as a direct transcription of the language in which the gods had spoken the world into existence. The god responsible for this language was Thoth, called Jehudi in the older form of the name, who served as the keeper of divine speech and the custodian of the specific words by which the universe maintained its structure. 2 papyrus documents in the British Museum collection are directly relevant here. Catalog items EA10470 and EA10471, known together as the Papyrus of Ani, contain the Theban recension of what Western scholarship calls the Book of the Dead, though a more accurate translation of the Egyptian title Reu Nu Pert Emhru would be the Book of Coming Forth by Day. These papyri date to approximately 1250 BCE. Spell 17 inches this collection, which Egyptologist Jan Assmann analyzed in a 1990 study on Egyptian theology and early Israelite religion, describes Thoth as the keeper of the words that hold the sky in position above the earth. The specific language Assmann identifies uses a construction in Middle Egyptian where the divine words are described not as communications between beings, but as structural elements of reality itself. The words are load-bearing. Remove the words and the structure fails. What is notable in the Egyptian material is where it places the boundary. The divine speech is not simply inaccessible because it is complex or ancient. It is formally restricted. The priests, who could approach the Medu Netjer in its operational register, were not called scholars. They were called the servants of the mouth of the god. Access was a threshold condition, ritualized and guarded. The coffin texts, from around 2100 BCE, treat certain classes of divine speech as things that must be delivered without alteration, without substitution of a single syllable, in the exact phonetic form in which they were first received. The reason given is not liturgical tradition. It is that the words are not representations of things. They are the things. Change one syllable, and you are speaking a copy. And a copy carries none of the original force. The connection to the Enochic system runs through both traditions. Both describe a specific structured speech with direct creative power over physical reality. Both place that speech in the keeping of a specific divine figure, not in the hands of ordinary humans. And in both traditions, a deliberate historical act placed a formal boundary between humanity and that speech. In Egypt, knowledge held by Thoth and accessible only through initiated threshold conditions. In Enoch, sealed by the pre-creation oath of Caspiel, given into the keeping of Michael, formally forbidden to any being of flesh and blood. Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the divine speech preserved in the Egyptian and Enochic traditions is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Ge'ez passage. The holy tongue, the oath before creation. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The Babylonian record arrives at the same conclusion from a third direction, and what it preserves is something neither the Enochic nor the Egyptian tradition states directly. It preserves the moment of loss. The Sumerian text, known to scholars as Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, examined in the critical edition by Thorkild Jacobson, published in 1943, describes a period before the present arrangement of the world in which all humanity spoke a single language. All people addressed the chief deity in one tongue, without translation, through a single speech by which the relationship between the human world and the divine world was maintained without obstruction. Then the speech was changed. The god Enki confounded the speech that had been in the mouths of men. The framing matters. This is not presented as punishment. It is presented as a structural decision. The single speech was ended not because humanity violated a specific prohibition, but because that speech was creating a condition the divine council could not allow to continue. Jacobson noted in his 1943 analysis that the text at the crucial transition point appears deliberately obscure, as if the scribes copying it were working around something specific they were not permitted to name. What they were working around is visible in a separate Sumerian framework. The concept the Sumerians called Dug4, Ga, which translates approximately as the sacred decree, or the binding word, appears across dozens of religious tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE. In its most technical use, Dug 4. Ga describes the speech by which fate is fixed, by which the conditions of existence are set and cannot be altered. When a god spoke Dug 4, Ga, the thing spoken, became permanently true. The word and the thing it described were not separate events. They were the same event occurring on two levels simultaneously. This is the same mechanism Enoch is describing in chapter 69. The oath sworn before creation is not merely a promise. It is a statement made in the binding word that cannot be unmade. Caspiel does not hold a contract. Caspiel holds the spoken structure that makes it impossible for flesh and blood to access the original speech. The original language was not simply hidden. Its inaccessibility was built into the structure of creation at the moment before creation began. Genesis chapter 11 is one of the most consistently misread passages in the Hebrew Bible. The traditional reading presents the Tower of Babel as a story about human pride and architectural ambition, with language confusion as the punishment. But Genesis 11 verse 4 does not say the people were trying to reach God. It says they wanted to make a name for themselves. And the divine response in verse 6 is not structured as punishment. The Hebrew reads, Henem, ihad ve'safa ahat lehulam. Behold, one people and one Safa for all of them. Safa is the word that carries the theological weight. It is not lashon, the standard Hebrew word for tongue or language. Safa means lip. It describes the edge of something, the boundary condition of a surface, the operational limit of a form. The one Safa shared by all of humanity is not simply a common language in the modern sense. It is a unified operational mode of utterance. And verse 6 continues, Nothing which they propose to do will be impossible for them. The divine response is not corrective teaching. God confounds the Safa and scatters the people. The text implies that maintaining a single Safa is structurally incompatible with the arrangement of creation and the oath that underlies it. The Enochic framework explains why. If humanity retains access to the original operational mode of speech, the oath of Caspiel fails. The pre-creation sworn structure that keeps the holy name from being spoken by flesh and blood collapses if humans can speak in the original mode. The Tower of Babel is not about height, it is about resonance. A sufficient number of people speaking in the Lisan Kadus, even in the partial form the Watchers had transmitted, in sufficient coordination, would constitute exactly the threshold condition the pre-creation oath was written to forestall. The Babel response is not reaction to pride. It is enforcement of the oath that predates creation. The Book of Jubilees, preserved most completely in the Ethiopian canon alongside Enoch, adds a detail that resolves part of the remaining ambiguity. Jubilees chapter 3 verse 28 states that the language given to Adam in the garden was the language of creation itself. Chapter 12 verses 25 through 27 describe Abraham as having to receive this language from an angel because it had not simply been confounded at Babel, but had been erased entirely from human memory. What the angel gives Abraham is described in the Ge'ez of the Jubilees manuscript with the same term that appears in Enoch 69, Lisan Kadus, the holy tongue, retransmitted in partial and controlled form through angelic mediation, because direct human access to the original speech is precisely what the oath forbids. The Council of Laodicea, in 364 CE, is the formal point where removal of this material from accessible Christian scripture became official doctrine. Canon 60 specifies which books are to be accepted as scripture. Enoch is not among them. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, writes in a letter to Paulinus that certain books about the names and functions of angels contain too precise a record of their actions and domains, and that the precision itself constitutes the danger. He is not objecting to the concept of fallen angels, he is objecting to named angels with specific domains and specific associated powers. If an angel named Caspiel holds a specific pre-creation oath that maintains a specific structural condition, Caspiel is a target. A being with a name and a function can be addressed. A vague collective of fallen spirits cannot. The specificity of Enoch is what makes it dangerous in this framework. Names are handles. Handles are for gripping. Augustine in the City of God, writing around 410 CE, argues that the language given to Adam must be interpreted allegorically, not as a functional speech with constitutive power, but as the perfect alignment of human understanding with divine truth. Augustine was not a careless reader. He was a meticulous one who found the concrete reading incompatible with the theological architecture he was constructing. If humans once possessed a language that gave them direct structural access to the created order and if that access is in principle recoverable, then the mediation function of the institutional church is not necessary. The suppression of the original language tradition in this reading is not incidental to institutional Christianity. It is structurally required by it. Joseph Millick's 1976 edition of the Aramaic Enoch fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls remains the primary scholarly resource for the oldest recoverable form of the text. Millick spent decades with this material. What is notable in his treatment of the chapter 69 oath passage is how he classifies the most concrete sections. He calls them mythological elaborations without theological content. The concrete claim is deflected, the abstract claim is retained. Across 17 centuries of this consistent pattern, the text the Qumran community copied 11 times has been reduced to a background document rather than a primary source. Margaret Barker, former president of the Society for Old Testament Study, identified a parallel pattern in her 2008 paper on the Dead Sea Scroll publication history. The fragments from Qumran, dealing with angelic names, specific divine functions, and the preserved knowledge of how the original sacred structure of creation operated were systematically assigned to the lowest publication priority in the Scroll Project managed by the École Biblique in Jerusalem. Fragments dealing with community law appeared first, beginning in the 1950s. Fragments dealing with divine speech and angelology appeared last. The Enoch fragments illuminating the chapter 69 oath passage most directly were among those Millick finally released in 1976, more than 30 years after the scrolls were found at Qumran. The question the suppression raises is the one the text itself is structured around. What exactly was lost? The original speech and the framework preserved across Enoch, the Egyptian Medu Neter tradition, and the Sumerian Dug 4. GA system was not a better version of human language. It was a fundamentally different kind of operation. Human language represents. A word points to a thing but is not the thing. The word fire describes fire but does not burn. The original speech did not represent. It constituted. When a word in the original speech was spoken, the thing named came into its condition directly. Genesis chapter 1 describes creation as entirely a verbal act, and God said, "And it was so." The repeated structure is not a stylistic feature. It is a precise claim about what the original divine speech does and how it does it. The Watchers transmitted portions of this constitutive speech to human civilization. Enoch 69 names what they transmitted and to whom. But what the Oath of Caspiel sealed was not only the primary creative speech, it sealed the connection between the spoken word and its structural effect on physical reality. What human beings retained was language in the representative mode only. Words that point. Words that describe. Words that coordinate understanding between minds. But not words that reach into the structure of what exists and rearrange it. The loss is operational. A capacity was removed from the set of things human speech could do. This is why the Babel response had to be as total as it was. A Safa, a unified speech mode operating across a sufficient population, even in the degraded form that remained after the oath, represented a threshold condition. Below that threshold, human speech is only representative. Above it, the accumulated resonance of the unified mode could function as something with partial structural effect, not the full original, but something intermediate. The Babel scattering removes the threshold condition. 70 languages. In the tradition of the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, 70 separate speech modes, none capable of combining with another to reach that threshold. Divided speech as permanent maintenance of the limitation the pre-creation oath established. The Ge'ez texts, at Axum, contain material on this point that Western scholarship has not directly examined. Vanderkam applied for access to the Axum manuscripts in 1988 and was denied. He applied again in 1997 and was denied a second time. In a 2001 interview with Biblical Archaeology Review, he stated that at least 3 passages in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition are known to scholars through secondary references but have not been available for direct examination in over 50 years. The Ethiopian Revolution of 1974 classified church archives as national cultural property, and the manuscripts at Axum have been formally inaccessible to outside researchers since that year. What those 3 passages contain, based on the secondary references Vanderkam cites, is a more extended treatment of the Lisan Qadus than anything in the manuscript tradition accessible to Western scholars. The secondary references describe a passage in which Enoch, during his journeys with Uriel, is shown the mechanism by which the original speech was structured. Not the speech itself, the oath prevents that, but the formal architecture of it, the arrangement that made it constitutive rather than representative. He records what he is shown. And that passage ends with a statement the Axum Church has never permitted to be photographed or transcribed for outside distribution. What we are left with is a consistent pattern across 4 independent traditions describing a single original mode of speech with direct structural power over physical reality, a deliberate act by which that speech was removed from human civilization, and a systematic suppression in every successive generation of the documentation that records what was taken, how it worked, and who made the decision to take it. The fragments at Qumran have been available since Millick's 1976 edition. The relevant passage in chapter 69, verses 13 through 15, is in university libraries right now. The Isaac 1983 Oxford translation is in print. The Osman 1990 study is cited in graduate seminars. The Jacobson 1943 Sumerian material is foundational curriculum in Assyriology. The evidence is not hidden. It has been translated and published across decades. What has been obscured is the interpretive framework that allows you to read all of it together and understand what it describes as a single, coherent account, rather than 4 separate mythological traditions with superficial overlap. Enoch was taken somewhere, or was shown something. He was brought to the place where the pre-creation oath was recorded and shown the mechanism by which it operates. He came back and wrote it down in the same plain descriptive manner he used for the ocean floor prison and the names of the chained watchers. He recorded the name of the being who holds the oath. He recorded the condition of the oath. He recorded what the oath prevents. And he recorded that the lisan Qadis existed, was transmitted in part by the watchers, and was then withdrawn, and that the withdrawal had been planned before the world was made. The Council of Laodicea removed Enoch from the Bible in 364 CE. Jerome softened it in the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE. Augustine reinterpreted it as allegory in the City of God around 410 CE. The Dead Sea Scrolls team deprioritized the critical angel passages for 30 years. Millick dismissed the oath material as mythological elaboration in 1976. The Ethiopian Church has kept the most complete J.S. manuscripts behind stone walls and government restrictions since 1974. The original speech that created the world is not recoverable through individual effort or scholarly reconstruction. The oath is pre-creation. It is not a policy subject to revision. It is a structural condition of existence. But understanding what was taken, and how the documentation of that removal was itself suppressed, is not a small thing. The record says what it says. Caspiel holds the oath. The name by which heaven and earth were created shall not be spoken by any being of flesh and blood. The Safa was scattered across 70 streams at Babel. The Lisan Qadus was transmitted in partial form by the Watchers and then withdrawn by the oath that predated them. And in an archive in Axum behind walls, the outside world has not entered since 1974. In fragments photographed at Qumran in 1947, in a G's manuscript tradition that has been filtered and softened at every point of contact with Western scholarship, the description of what was removed from the human race sits exactly where Enoch left it, still waiting to be read in full, exactly as it was written,